He had prestigious school in the heart of America, a brilliant young student named Marcus Johnson, whose quiet determination shone through despite the daily struggles, found himself caught in a web of injustice and prejudice. At Westridge Academy, a place where tradition reigned and rigid standards were enforced without mercy, his sudden absences from class set off a chain of dramatic events that would culminate in an unforgettable act of redemption. Mrs. Valencia Matthews, a teacher known for her uncompromising standards and icy demeanor, greeted her students each morning with a crisp "Good morning, class" as she strode confidently through the hallways in her sensible 6-inch heels. With her blonde hair meticulously gathered and her classroom arranged like clockwork, she believed she was sculpting the future of America by instilling discipline and order. But beneath the pristine exterior of Westridge, Marcus's story was one of hidden pain and systemic bias. For 3 consecutive days, his empty desk in the 3rd row stood as a testament not only to his unexplained absences, but also to the subtle racist assumptions that had long plagued the institution. Instead of investigating the reasons behind his silence with empathy, Mrs. Matthews sharpened her red pen over his name on the attendance sheet, her voice laced with derision as she declared, "Advanced literature is clearly optional for you, Mr. Johnson." Her scathing tone, coupled with the disapproving glances exchanged among her colleagues, fed a growing undercurrent of anger and indignation among those who knew Marcus's true character and his brilliant intellect. As the classroom buzzed with nervous whispers, Mrs. Matthews continued her lecture on American literature. Every word was an assault on Marcus's dignity. She even mocked his scholarship, noting with a sneer how the board had forced his admission solely to diversify the student body in an expensive institution where every penny mattered. With each passing moment, the tension escalated, and her condescending remarks painted a clear picture of a teacher more interested in punishment than in nurturing potential, particularly when that potential came from a student of color whose struggles were overlooked in favor of maintaining her uncompromising image. Throughout that day, the chill of prejudice was palpable. While other teachers worried about outside circumstances affecting a student's performance, Mrs. Matthews dismissed Marcus's absences as nothing more than a lack of discipline and commitment. Rumors of personal tragedy and systemic neglect swirled around him like an inescapable storm. Yet she remained blind to his hardships. Instead of offering support, she threatened him with the harshest consequences, failing the course and jeopardizing his place at Westridge. However, as the day ended and the hallways emptied, a quiet resolve began to kindle within Marcus. He would not be defined by her venom or society's dismissive expectations. In a twist that left the school buzzing with astonishment, Marcus's response to this relentless cruelty and deep-seated racism transformed into an act of monumental retribution. No longer would the silence of the oppressed be mistaken for weakness. Instead, it would become a powerful declaration of strength, a promise that one day the scales of justice would tip in favor of those who had been forced to the margins for far too long. In the hallowed halls of Westridge Academy, a brewing storm was unfolding behind the polished veneer, a tempest that would forever alter the lives of those involved. The troubled student, now known as Malcolm Evans, faced the wrath of the formidable Ms. Matthews, a teacher whose reputation for rigid discipline was both feared and reviled. On that fateful afternoon, following another unexplained absence, Ms. Matthews fixed Malcolm with a steely gaze that bore into his very soul and declared their conversation would resume later in detention. Room 103. Malcolm, shoulders squared in quiet defiance, simply nodded. As he walked away, the clack of his worn sneakers on the tile was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence, a silent testament to the inner turmoil he harbored. Before Malcolm could escape the tightening grip of Ms. Matthews' authority, her voice cut sharply through the corridor. "Whatever is keeping you from my classroom had better be truly extraordinary," she admonished. In that moment, the relentless pounding of her high heels echoed behind him as she stalked after him, leaving Malcolm standing vulnerable in the midst of the bustling hallway. His classmate Rebecca hurried to catch up, her whispered apology barely audible amidst the clamor. Malcolm's quiet, "Not your fault," revealed a heaviness far beyond mere truancy, a secret burden born from years of systemic neglect. The tension only intensified as Ms. Matthews' harsh words escalated into a public spectacle. Before heading to a faculty meeting, she confronted Malcolm one last time, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Amidst murmurs of discontent, Assistant Principal Davis joined the fray, his concern about Malcolm's academic record momentarily softening the cruelty of Ms. Matthews. Yet even as he proposed a conference to explore Malcolm's complicated family circumstances, she coldly dismissed any notion of leniency, insisting that rules were absolute. "Explanations without documentation are merely stories," she snapped, her voice echoing the unyielding ethos of a system steeped in prejudice. In that cramped detention room, the air grew thick with unspoken accusations as Miss Matthews meticulously scrutinized Malcolm's assignments. Her narrow, skeptical eyes scanned each page, noting that his analysis of literary works was surprisingly insightful, a stark contradiction to the image she had carefully constructed of him. Malcolm's subtle defiance shone through when he admitted that his recent breakthroughs in understanding were fueled by hours of self-study despite missing class discussions. His words, though measured, resonated with the weight of someone who had faced hardship and discrimination far beyond the classroom. As Ms. Matthews' facade of indifference wavered, a flicker of reluctant respect surfaced, quickly suppressed by her ingrained disdain for any deviation from her strict regime. Her next words, laced with derision, cut deep. "If you believe that your personal circumstances exempt you from accountability, then perhaps you misunderstand the nature of excellence." In that moment, an undeniable tension charged the room, a collision between a student's painful reality and an educator's relentless, oppressive ideology. Malcolm's tired eyes, shadowed by dark circles from unspoken struggles, silently pleaded for understanding in a world that had long denied him a fair chance. The meeting ended with a terse promise from Ms. Matthews to revisit the issue the following day. Malcolm left room 113 with a heavy heart and a resolute spirit, a vow that this injustice would not go unanswered. In the quiet moments that followed, the seeds of retribution and redemption took root, promising an outcome so dramatic and profound that even the most skeptical onlookers would be left in awe. In a modest apartment block far removed from the polished corridors of Westridge Academy, the tension between Ms. Matthews and Malcolm Evans reached a boiling point one cool, late afternoon. Malcolm had always carried the weight of his world on tired shoulders, a burden not just of academic expectations, but of a life defined by hardship and systemic neglect. That day, as Miss Matthews, ever the stern enforcer of rules and rigid standards, knocked on the door of apartment 312, she expected to find another delinquent student defiant in the face of authority. Instead, the door opened a crack to reveal Malcolm's anxious yet resolute face. His eyes, shadowed with deep fatigue from long nights spent burning the midnight oil to complete assignments between 2 and 4 a.m., mirrored a soul shaped by trials that were far more severe than mere absences in class. Miss Matthews, who prided herself on her uncompromising discipline, could not ignore the stark contrast between Malcolm's impeccable academic record and the disconcerting pattern of absences that now demanded her scrutiny. As she stepped into the narrow hallway of the apartment building, she was greeted by an elderly woman peering out of a ground floor window. The woman's gentle inquiry, "You looking for someone, miss?" hinted at the humble reality of this neighborhood, a far cry from the plush environment of Westridge Academy, and for the first time, a subtle chill of dissonance crept into Miss Matthews' composed exterior. With a dismissive tone that failed to mask her internal conflict, Miss Matthews announced, "I'm here for Malcolm Evans," even though her mind was still reeling from the shock of discovering his personal struggles. Before the door was fully opened, Malcolm's eyes filled with a mix of apprehension and a quiet resolve as he recognized the unmistakable insignia of authority in Miss Matthews' tone. "Miss Matthews? Mr. Evans?" he asked in a soft, measured voice. His voice betrayed not defiance but a weary resignation. "You missed detention," Miss Matthews stated briskly, her voice echoing through the narrow entryway as she eyed the worn carpet and the peeling paint, a stark contrast to her meticulously maintained classroom at school. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he inquired, "How did you even find my address?" His tone carried the edge of desperation born from a life where every moment was a struggle and every extra step felt like an uphill battle measured in miles of hardship. Miss Matthews replied curtly, "School records." That answer, so matter-of-fact and devoid of any real empathy, only deepened the chasm between them. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken truths. From within, a soft, persistent cough emerged, a sound that resonated with the sorrow and pain of a woman too frail to care for herself. Malcolm's eyes darted towards that sound, as if it spoke volumes of his own hidden torment and unyielding responsibility. "Is that your mother?" Miss Matthews inquired, her tone attempting to remain professional but laced with an unmistakable note of disdain. Malcolm hesitated, torn between protecting his family's privacy and the need to explain the circumstances that had forced his hands on so many mornings. A weak, tender voice called from the inner room. "Who's there, honey?" And in that moment, Malcolm's world narrowed to this single, heart-wrenching reality, the care of his ailing mother. "You need to leave, please," Malcolm said softly, his voice trembling slightly as he pulled the door closed behind him, half in retreat and half in protest. For the first time, Ms. Matthews saw the raw vulnerability in Malcolm's eyes. Vulnerability that had been masked by calculated composure for far too long. The sight sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through her, a mixture of pity and irritation warred with her ingrained belief that rules existed above all else. Yet, even as she paused at the threshold, her mind reeled back to the countless hours she had spent building a reputation on the back of rigid standards and the unyielding enforcement of discipline. In her mind, Malcolm was just another scholarship statistic, a student whose absences could be chalked up to an unwillingness to adhere to the unbending rules of academic excellence. But as Malcolm's tired, determined face receded into the dim light of the corridor, Ms. Matthews felt an unexpected churning of emotions that she had long thought she could suppress. The revelation of Malcolm's nightly sacrifices, a secret life of working a midnight shift as a security guard at a local shipping warehouse, of battling the unrelenting demands of a system that had never once considered the inequities of his background, forced her to confront the uncomfortable reality that perhaps her judgment had been clouded by centuries-old prejudices and a callous adherence to protocol. For years she had justified her severity by arguing that there was no room for excuses in the real world, that pain and hardship were simply obstacles to be overcome. Now, confronted with the undeniable truth that Malcolm's academic brilliance was fueled by a desperate need to provide for his ailing mother, Ms. Matthews' certainty began to waver. The drive to Malcolm's modest apartment had taken her through parts of the city she rarely ventured into. Areas measured in miles not by wealth, but by the depth of struggle. As Miss Matthews parked her luxury sedan, she found herself standing in the midst of brick buildings, encircling a small courtyard with patchy grass and struggling trees. Every step towards apartment 312 further eroded the barriers she had so long maintained between herself and the realities of the world beyond Westridge's pristine walls. At that moment, a quiet anger began to brew inside her, not just towards Malcolm for his perceived failures, but at the entire system that had allowed such profound inequality to persist. Once inside the apartment building, Ms. Matthews' internal monologue battled between an old world of strict discipline and a dawning awareness of a flawed system that had long favored the privileged at the expense of the deserving. She recalled the endless pattern of Malcolm's absences, always Monday and Tuesday, never on Thursdays or Fridays, and the chilling reality that while his grades soared, his health and family life crumbled under the weight of poverty. Yet she was determined to maintain her authority, determined to remind him of the consequences of deviating from the expected norm. As she confronted him, her voice remained clipped and precise. "You are here, Malcolm Evans, and you know why. Your absences have consequences." The cold, measured cadence of her words cut through the thin air of the apartment corridor, echoing like a verdict in a court where justice was preordained by the rigid rules she so venerated. Malcolm's eyes, however, held a quiet fire, a determination that belied his exhaustion. "Miss Matthews, I have done everything I can. I work nights to support my mother, and I finish my assignments even when I'm fighting the darkness alone," he replied, his tone soft but firm. In that moment, The room seemed to expand with the weight of his unsaid plea, that the world was not as black and white as her textbooks claimed, that behind every rule lay a human story marked by struggle and sacrifice. The collision of their worlds was stark, one rooted in the unyielding traditions of an elite institution, the other in the raw, unfiltered reality of life on the margins. For a long, tense moment, Ms. Matthews stared at Malcolm, her mind grappling with the undeniable evidence of his hardship. His assignments, meticulously completed in the dead of night, were filled with a maturity and insight that challenged everything she believed about discipline and performance. She recalled reading his personal essay, in which he had written about the one constant his mother had taught him, that education is the one thing no one can take from you. It was a truth that now reverberated in the silence between them. "You should understand, Malcolm, that rules exist for a reason," she finally said, though her tone was softer than usual, a crack in the facade of her unyielding authority. "I know you work hard, but your absences endanger your future here." Malcolm's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he responded, "I do it for survival, for honor, and for the promise of a better life for my mother and me. I am not asking for special treatment, I am simply asking for compassion." His words, fraught with the sorrow of countless sleepless nights and the relentless grind of a low-wage job, echoed in the small room like a plea for justice. In that charged moment, Ms. Matthews realized that every policy, every rigid standard she had clung to, had inadvertently contributed to a cycle of cruelty that stripped away the dignity of those who needed help the most. It was then that an unexpected resolve began to kindle within Malcolm. A determination to not only survive, but to one day overturn the oppressive system that had long marginalized students like him. His silent vow promised that one day the scales of justice would be set aright, in a retribution that would shake the very foundations of the academy and leave even the most hardened onlookers in awe. Ms. Matthews, meanwhile, felt her carefully constructed world tremble at the realization that her own cruelty and callous adherence to outdated protocols could soon be exposed for what it was, a mechanism of systematic oppression that crushed the hopes of deserving young minds. As the minutes ticked by and the distant sound of coughing mingled with the muted hum of life from other apartments, the confrontation reached a turning point. Malcolm's voice, now barely above a whisper, resonated with the conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You need to leave, Miss Matthews, and let me tend to my family. I cannot continue to bear this burden under your watch." His plea was not just for his sake, but for all those who had been trampled upon by an education system built on exclusion and relentless judgment. In that poignant, fraught exchange, the old order began to crack. Ms. Matthews, whose identity had been inseparably tied to the enforcement of harsh standards and the perpetuation of racial prejudice, found herself confronted by a soul that refused to be silenced. The fight was no longer about punctuality or mere academic attendance. It was a battle for dignity, equality, and the right to be seen as more than a statistic in a system that valued conformity over compassion. In the dim light of that modest apartment corridor, the desperation in Malcolm Evans's eyes stirred in Ms. Matthews a combination of guilt and concern that she had never allowed herself to feel before. Standing there, on the threshold between her cold, unyielding world and the raw reality before her, Miss Matthews spoke quietly. "Malcolm, I came because I am trying to understand your situation, your repeated absences, your late-night submissions, and your deep sense of responsibility to your family." Her tone, though laced with the usual authority, betrayed a wavering resolve as she tried to piece together the fragments of his troubled life. Malcolm's composure faltered for a moment as he looked away, as if burdened by the weight of unspoken truths. "You talked to Mrs. Patterson downstairs," he murmured, his voice almost lost beneath the soft hum of a distant coughing that grew ever more urgent from within the apartment. Miss Matthews nodded slowly, her mind racing to reconcile the images of the scholarly student she had so long judged with disdain and the harsh reality unfolding before her. "You mentioned your night job and your mother's health," she continued, hesitating only briefly before the next words threatened to spill over her professional facade. I want to help, Malcolm. Whatever you're going through, you shouldn't have to bear it alone." For a heartbeat, Malcolm's eyes flickered with vulnerability, a silent testament to the harsh truths hidden behind his determined expression. Reluctantly, he opened the door wider and, with a hesitant intonation that betrayed his inner conflict, introduced, "Mum, this is Ms. Matthews. She is my English teacher." Inside the small, meticulously kept living room that had been transformed into a makeshift hospital, a frail woman lay propped against several pillows, surrounded by humming medical equipment and a quiet array of prescription bottles. That woman, Diane Williams, bore striking resemblance to the proud, determined mother Malcolm had once spoken of in his assignments. Despite her weakened state, her eyes held the same strength and gentle warmth that had once inspired Malcolm to excel. "Your English teacher," Malcolm repeated softly, as Diane attempted to sit up straighter. "She's spoken so highly of your class." The unexpected kindness in his tone, far removed from the harsh reprimands of recent days, caught Ms. Matthews off guard. The room, decorated with photographs of a younger Diane in a nurse's uniform and snapshots of happier times when Malcolm was an award-winning student on brightly lit school stages, resonated with a history of love, struggle, and sacrifice. After a heavy pause, Ms. Matthews managed to steady her voice. "I am sorry for the unexpected visit, Mrs. Williams," she finally said, her usual crisp confidence subdued into something softer, more tentative. "Please, call me Diane." The gentle reply that came from the bed was accompanied by a weak smile and a barely perceptible nod. "Malcolm, would you mind getting Ms. Matthews a glass of water?" Diane asked, and though Malcolm hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his mother's side, he promptly retreated to the small kitchen area. Left alone for a moment, Miss Matthews absorbed every detail of the room. The neat rows of medical textbooks, the organized calendar marked with countless appointments, and the stark evidence of hardship that lay in every corner. It was not hard for her to piece together the gravity of his reality. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer had been diagnosed in his mother 3 months before, a diagnosis that carried the silent weight of impending loss. When Malcolm returned with the water, his every action was marked by practiced efficiency and a subtle protective urgency. "Miss Matthews, I want you to understand," he began, his voice firm but weary. "I am not trying to get out of school. I need to be here, to learn, to escape, even for a little while, from everything that's happening at home." His eyes, tired yet defiant, told a story of nights spent working a midnight shift as a security guard at a shipping warehouse, long hours where he earned $12 an hour from midnight until 6 a.m., and a day-to-day life balanced precariously on the edge of financial ruin and personal sacrifice. Despite it all, his grade point average remained an unblemished 4, a silent rebellion against a system that had long failed to acknowledge the bruises inflicted by poverty and discrimination. Ms. Matthews listened, an internal storm of conflicting emotions brewing within her. She recalled her own unyielding commitment to academic standards, her belief that there was simply no room for excuses in the relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet here was Malcolm, whose life was measured in sleepless hours and painstaking caregiving, whose very existence was a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of relentless adversity. "Your essay on the Great Gatsby," Ms. Matthews said suddenly, her voice catching as she recalled the symbolic green light as a beacon of hope that Malcolm had so eloquently described. "You wrote about that light representing hope that sustains us through impossible circumstances. It wasn't just literary analysis, was it?" Malcolm met her gaze steadily, replying, "Literature helps us process our own realities, doesn't it? Isn't that what you've always taught us?" His words, unadorned and sincere, carried the weight of someone who had known too much hardship too soon. Over the next several minutes, the room was filled with a charged silence, punctuated only by the occasional beep of a medical device and the soft rustle of papers as Malcolm retrieved a neatly folded document from his back pocket. "This is my mother's care schedule and the doctor's recommendation for nursing care," he explained quietly, extending the paper toward Ms. Matthews. "I should have provided this as documentation for my absences, but I never wanted to be seen as a charity case." Ms. Matthews scanned the document. The crisp letters on the doctor's letterhead affirmed the severe reality of his situation. The more she read, the more the rigid walls of her long-held beliefs began to crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. "Why didn't you speak with the administration about this?" she asked, a note of regret seeping into her voice. "Westridge offers hardship provisions for students in difficult circumstances." Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone resolute. "I understand your policies, Miss Matthews. I know my absences have consequences, but I am not choosing to miss class. I am choosing to care for my mother so that she can have a little dignity in her final days, and so that I can continue my education without interruption. Westridge is my ticket to a better future, a future that may include a full scholarship to a medical school that understands what it means to fight against the odds." Diane, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious pain, interjected gently, "Your education means everything to him. He is determined and he refuses to let adversity define his future." The room, once filled with the sterile chill of institutional detachment, now hummed with the raw emotion of a young man's fierce determination and a mother's unwavering love. Miss Matthews felt a deep, unexpected sting in her heart. A blend of guilt for years spent enforcing unyielding standards without empathy, and a burgeoning desire to right the wrongs inflicted by an education system that valued conformity over compassion. As the confrontation unfolded, Malcolm continued, "I sold our house last year to pay for Mum's initial treatments. Our apartment is temporary, and I am applying for additional financial aid, but many of these programs have long waiting lists. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for an acknowledgement that my situation is real and that it cannot simply be measured by a rigid attendance policy." His words resonated with clarity, echoing through the small space like a plea for justice that transcended simple academic metrics. For the first time in her long career at Westridge, Ms. Matthews realized that the student she had so confidently castigated as irresponsible was, in fact, carrying a burden so immense that it dwarfed the petty infractions of tardiness and absences. Here was a young man whose late-night essays, meticulously completed at 2:37 a.m. or 3:14 a.m. while others slept peacefully, were not expressions of defiance, but survival tools. A means to secure his future amidst an ongoing personal tragedy. The clinical language of the medical document, the precision of the timestamps, and the bitter irony of a student forced to balance caregiving with academic brilliance all converged into a story of hardship that demanded not harsh punishment, but understanding and, perhaps, a long overdue retribution against a system that had long exploited the vulnerable. In that quiet space, filled with the soft murmur of machines and the palpable weight of responsibility, Ms. Matthews's hardened exterior finally began to fracture. "Malcolm, I see now that my judgments were far too simplistic," she admitted, her voice soft yet laced with a new resolve. "I have always believed that excellence was achieved by sheer will and adherence to strict rules. But in your case, I realize that the system itself has failed you in ways that no classroom discipline can fix. I understand now that what you are enduring is not a matter of laziness or disrespect. It is a battle for survival and dignity." A tear glistened at the corner of Malcolm's eye as he absorbed her words. "I just need normalcy," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I need to be in that classroom where literature is not just words on a page but a sanctuary, a place where I can momentarily escape the harsh realities of my home life." His declaration, free from any hint of defiance, carried an urgency that demanded not only recognition but immediate action. Ms. Matthews, deeply moved by the earnest vulnerability before her, knew that this revelation could no longer be ignored. As she gathered her thoughts and the evidence of Malcolm's struggles, she vowed internally that the time had come to challenge the oppressive policies of Westridge Academy. This would not be a quiet plea for leniency but a monumental act of retribution, a dramatic reversal designed to shock the institution into realizing that its inflexible standards and blatant disregard for the lived realities of its students were no longer acceptable. The passion in Malcolm's words, the stark documentation of a young man's endless nights and relentless sacrifice, ignited something within her that would fuel a crusade for fairness and compassion. Standing in that modest apartment, with the scent of antiseptic mingling with the tangible hope in Malcolm's determined gaze, Ms. Matthews resolved that her actions from this day forward would be marked by empathy over cruelty. In a final, quiet moment before the conversation drew to a close, she reassured him, We will talk about your attendance record tomorrow. For now, focus on what truly matters, taking care of your mother and yourself." As she stepped out and closed the door behind her, the echoes of Malcolm's raw honesty and the undeniable evidence of his hardship trailed after her like a solemn promise. A promise that, someday soon, the scales of justice would tip in favor of those who have long suffered under a system rigged to punish rather than to protect. Malcolm Evans, once judged harshly by Ms. Matthews, now stood as a living testament to resilience amid a system steeped in rigid rules and silent discrimination. In the final chapters of his story, Ms. Matthews, whose uncompromising ways had long defined her career, finally began to see the true cost of enforcing attendance policies without compassion. As she reviewed Malcolm's deeply moving essays, writing that revealed his struggle to balance night shifts at a shipping warehouse and caring for his ailing mother, diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, she was struck by the quiet dignity in his words. Malcolm's assignments, submitted at ungodly hours between 2:30 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., were more than literary analyses. They were desperate pleas for understanding in a world that too often judged based on appearances and rigid numbers. Determined to correct past injustices, Ms. Matthews proposed a modified attendance policy to Principal Harrington that would allow for remote learning on days Malcolm's caregiving duties prevented him from physically attending class. This groundbreaking change, paired with a new caregiver support grant established by the school, signaled a bold retribution, a compassionate revolution designed to ensure that true academic excellence includes understanding, empathy, and the recognition that every student's struggle deserves respect.